Welcome everybody to MLaw's second event of 2014. Today's panel, Googling the NSA, Accountability in the Age of Big Data, promises to be an informative session. Before we begin, I would like to just do some brief acknowledgments and thank yous to people whose advice and help helped get us to this point today. So very, very briefly, I would like to just thank Provost Hamilton, Deans Townsend, McIntosh, Beardsley, Russell, Moyer, Law Deans Haddon, Gontram, Krinsky. A lot of deans helped to make this happen, everybody. You should appreciate that. With that, I would like to thank my staff, and I will introduce myself in a moment, Brandy Pettis and Erica Smith, who are MLaw Assistant Directors. I would like to thank Enzo Ferruggiaro, who's the MLaw Coordinator, Tiffany Burba, Mickey Hartz, and Mariel from the law school. Tiffany and Mickey are student workers within the MLaw office. We couldn't do this without you. My name is Robert Koulish. I'm Director of MLaw Programs, and I'm going to be your moderator today. We have a fantastic panel featuring Len Moodispaw, James Grimmelmann, Jim Lynch, Michael Greenberger. I will give you their brief bios. I can't even do justice to all their accomplishments. They are free to expound upon it or to correct anything that I've said that's inaccurate in a few minutes. So today we're going to be focusing on the NSA, big data. Our speakers were asked to speak on these issues in any number of ways based upon their research, their interests. So what I'm looking for is a lively and dynamic and informative session. I think we're going to get to that. Now, it wasn't all that long ago that the NSA, the National Security Agency, was known by a lot of people who knew of it, and many of us didn't know much about the NSA. It was known as No Such Agency for NSA, or Not Say Anything. This is what people thought of the NSA because it was secretive and people just didn't talk about it. It was known for its secrecy. Few people knew much about it. Fewer people really cared. All that has changed in the last several months. In the last several months, the NSA is topping the headlines. It's the talk of our political leaders even today. We'll make mention of that in a few minutes. Everyday citizens at the water coolers. We're talking about the NSA. We're talking about NSA former contractor Edward Snowden. To some, Edward Snowden is a hero, is a whistleblower. To others, he is a traitor. The consensus, though, is whatever we may think about Edward Snowden and what he did, and the panelists are invited to share their thoughts on this, and I believe they will. The consensus is that it's because of Snowden that so much of the public now is talking about the NSA and now has an awareness of at least some of what the NSA has been doing. Only some, small portion, but perhaps this is in the public interest, and this is one of the issues that we're going to be talking about. So people are talking. It's in the newspaper every day. It's on the news. It's on throughout social media. Conversations and dialogues and chat rooms about the bulk collection of phone records, the NSA's infiltration of links to Google and Yahoo data, its coordination with the big three phone companies. It's widely known and assumed that the NSA now has access to our personal information, phone records, emails, how we surf the internet. Like it or not, what the NSA does, it affects all of us, okay? Every day, we'll be talking about this. I hope the panelists will share their views on this. I'm very, very pleased to be introducing Len Moodispaw. Len is CEO and president of KEYW Corporation. I believe KEYW is named for Len's favorite vacation spot, Key West. At least according to the Baltimore Sun, that's what it is. Feel free to correct. KEYW is a small, powerful, agile cybersecurity company specializing in what they refer to as cyber superiority. It's known for its strong and trusting relationships with the federal government's defense and intelligence agencies. Second, we have Professor James Grimmelmann from the University of Maryland, Carey School of Law. Professor Grimmelmann directs the Intellectual Property Program. His specialty is in intellectual property. He has written extensively on how the law governing the creation and use of computer software affects individual freedom and the distribution of wealth and power. The professor has authored Speech Engines, The Merchants of MOOCs, and Big Data's Other Privacy Programs, among other things. Professor Michael Greenberger from the University of Maryland Carey School of Law is director of the Center of Health and Human Security. He was partner for 20 years at Shea and Gardner. Among Professor Greenberger's many responsibilities and accolades, he serves as technical advisor on the UN Commission of Experts on International Money and Financial Systems. He has been named to the International Energy Forum's Independent Expert Group, chair of the Maryland Governor's Emergency Management Advisory Council, and much more. Last but certainly not least is University of Maryland College Park's own Professor James Lynch, who is chair of the UMCP Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice, which I might add is ranked #1 in the country. Professor Lynch came to the University of Maryland from the Obama administration, where he served as director of the Bureau of Justice Statistics. Professor Lynch has authored several books and articles on crime statistics, victimization, risk, and the role of sanctions in social control. Without further ado, I would like to start what I hope is a very lively conversation with Len Moodispaw. Len.
Thank you, Robert, and I had to make a few notes based on a few things you said to make sure I don't forget. Enzo, do me a favor, if I get to my 10 minutes or whatever, wave at me, because this topic I can expound on forever, as Professor Greenberger knows, because I was honored to be with his class in Baltimore a couple of weeks ago. Just a little bit more about my background, which will set the context, I hope, for my comments. When I graduated from college, I went to work at the National Security Agency for about 15 years. Most of you weren't born in the days when Richard Nixon was president, but I was riding around with anti-Nixon bumper stickers, and I assure you I was the only person in the NSA parking lot who dared to do that. I left there and went out to practice law, which I did in Annapolis as a litigator, but during that period of time I got very involved with the American Civil Liberties Union. I've done driving while black cases, if you've heard of those sorts of things. I've done a lot of work for ACLU, and having done my taxes, I can tell you I just gave them over almost $40,000 last year again. So I'm a big believer in ACLU and a supporter of ACLU. That's relevant to some of the comments I will make later. I've been running companies for the last 15 years. KEYW is named for Key West. I just returned from Key West yesterday. We had our second annual investor weekend down there. Nice of you all to have this weather for me after I came back from a beautiful weekend in Key West. And we have that name because I was a parrot head before they had names for us. So if you were to read any of our SEC documents, you would see quotes from Jimmy Buffett, and which drives bankers and accountants and lawyers crazy because you're not supposed to do that, but we do that sort of thing. So this particular company, KEYW, follows up on a company that was acquired a few years back, and we do a great deal of very high-tech work for the National Security Agency and all the other defense agencies. Out of that has come some commercial products in the area of cybersecurity, very unique products that look at it from a different way and are protecting networks differently than anybody else is. So we're primarily government right now, but we are commercial, going down a commercial path. Our folks, our technical folks, have been designing the defensive systems for this country, particularly for the intelligence business, for a number of years. Now, I caution you, and you're not allowed to ask me any technical questions because I can't answer them. I'm a recovering lawyer. I don't understand anything the company does, but I can pontificate about it all night long. But that's our work. That's what we've been doing for quite some time. So on this topic, I am often asked, as I did with Professor Greenberger a while back, to talk about my view of a number of these topics that we're talking about today. And certainly big data is one of the things that we have to deal with in order to find the bad guys. And that's what the country and the intelligence business is dedicated to doing, finding the bad guys. After September 11th, the intelligence business was criticized for not connecting the dots, not being able to find various pieces of data and put them together to find bad guys. So that's what the efforts have been directed to ever since that time. And that's what our company does, is a great deal of support for the intelligence business in those areas. Putting my ACLU hat on, I will tell you that I have for quite some time been fussing at Senator Mikulski, who's on the Senate Intelligence Committee, Congressman Ruppersberger, who's on the House Intelligence Committee, and I've been telling them, you guys are too easy. You're giving the NSA and the others too much freedom. They don't need all those things. So let me be very clear that I don't want the access to data that the agency has. Let me come back to that in a moment. That said, and this is one point I feel very strongly about, I do not agree with anybody who thinks NSA has violated any laws. They have a substantial amount of oversight from the Senate and House Intelligence Committees. They get a great deal of oversight from a number of other folks. And so while we may not like the practices, I will argue to the cows come home, as we lawyers do, that they haven't broken any laws. We may need to change the laws. I don't believe they've broken any laws. I was reading recently about the Consumer Electronics Show out in Vegas, I think. And one of the apps that was presented was one where if you're standing at the door of the window of a department store, the department store sees what you're looking at and will immediately send you a note saying, hi there, we can sell you that shirt at a discount if you want. And those kinds of techniques were discussed at the Consumer Electronics Show. But a woman who was in charge of some consumer association said, I will give up a little privacy for a discount. So think about that. Will you give up a little privacy for a discount, but not to prevent another 9/11? Now, once again, I am the person who's a strong advocate for civil liberties, but we're in that sort of environment. As Robert said, when you open yourselves up to Facebook and Twitter and so on, you should have no expectation of privacy, in my view. Maybe that's not right, but you should have no expectation of privacy. Depending on the audience, I've been known to say, under those circumstances, think about the fact that internet and privacy just don't go together in one sentence. Kind of like Fox and journalism don't go together in one sentence, but that's a whole different story. Sometimes I get booed when I make those remarks. But that's the environment we're working in. Do not be surprised. Don't act shocked, and I hope you don't, when you have Google and Microsoft and those people, when the phone company's wringing hands saying, oh my goodness, what are they doing? We didn't know that. Am I allowed to say bullshit?
Just
Right.
I say it in class.
Thank you. Actually, there's a comedian who once said, if you look it up in Webster's dictionary between, I think it's a bull shank and something else, you'll find a sedate word that fits this. Anyhow, when you've had the foreign governments say, oh my gosh, they're doing that to us. So one of the latest revelations from Snowden was Huawei saying, oh, how can they do that to us? Well, if you take a chart and you look at Nortel's business revenue declining and Huawei's business going up, you'll see the answer to that question. Huawei actually had access to the Nortel CEO's computer and was managing the company essentially. So those kind of people can't complain. You mentioned in your comments, Robert, the attention that came out of Snowden and how now a lot of people are talking about that. And certainly a lot of people are talking about it. But if the ACLU Washington office were here, they would tell you that I, and other advocates have been for quite some time on this very point, arguing with Congress, arguing with the administrations about the pervasiveness of data. Easy for me to say, however. So yes, it's getting widespread publicity these days, but it is certainly something some of us have been talking about for some time. But that said, I have greater faith in the intelligence community professional who's working a shift work job at NSA in protecting the privacy of Americans unless they are a, quote, person of interest. And in order to be a person of interest, there's some steps that one has to go through to get there. Than I do politicians who take data, to grab social media, who have snippets of data and run off with it and act like it is real fact. The professionals do not care despite all your anecdotes you may hear, they don't care about the personal lives of anybody unless that person is a person of interest. So all the stories about somebody's lover looking out for somebody spying on them doesn't happen. So questions that I'll pose to you, but then we can answer as time goes on, are, do you think that NSA collects every phone call that any American makes? Do you think it's every phone call? Do you think it includes cell phones? I'll answer the question later when we get into the conversation. And then we can talk about Snowden, and I'll just offer this to you, and then we'll talk about that in some more detail. Do you think that all the data that Snowden took and is releasing is related to the intelligence business? And if it were different, would that make a difference in your view as to what he has released? And do you think he acted on his own and was just a good whistleblower? One little fact for you. Before he went to work at Booz Allen, my company interviewed him. Now, this was a company that we since acquired, so it wasn't our company at the time. But I have the notes from when they interviewed him. And the notes said, we turned him down because he isn't qualified, and he seems to have a particular agenda in mind, being disgruntled. Little known fact, not many people have talked about this, but when he was at CIA, he was disciplined 3 times. That's 4 fingers 3 times. Once, for example, trying to hack into this personnel system to change his personnel appraisal. Now, the biggest problem about that is when he went overseas for Booz Allen, he went through the NSA security system, and they didn't know what the CIA security system knew. So that's a whole different issue. So I'll stop at that point. We can talk about Snowden a whole lot more when the Q&A period comes. Okay?
I'd like to talk about big data and the degree to which reinforces the old axiom, knowledge is power, and who uses that power, over whom, and for what ends. Starting point, I'll take off from an idea described by Vannevar Bush, 1945. So before the modern age of computers, decades, half a century before anybody thought of coining the term big data. It's the idea of a memex. An essay titled, As We Shall Think, he described the memex, a researcher's desk that would organize all the information you could ever want. And of course, he was working with 1945 era technology, so he envisioned it in terms of dials and knobs and a pointer and microfilm. Lots and lots of microfilm projected onto the surface of the desk. And you would flip through documents, making an associational trail from one to another. If you're researching the history of the longbow, you might research material products about wood, the history of the Crusades, military technology, novels, stories of Robin Hood, and weaving them all together into a new research trail that would connect the ideas of those who've gone before you to new discoveries. He described, in other words, the experience of sitting at a computer, missing almost all the physical details, because it turns out that electronics are much cheaper and easier to work with. But he got the fundamental task of the knowledge worker, stitching together information, basically right, decades before the reality caught up. And this relationship between computing technology, giving the power of knowledge, is as old as computing technology. Where did IBM come from? From Herman Hollerith's computing devices for the census. Electronic machines that took mechanical cards and counted up the number of people matching different categories. And that power today is extrapolated into the same kinds of gathering lots of data that lets Walmart decide exactly how many of each kind of product to send to each of its thousands of stores each week, based upon millions of observations about how fast things are flying off the shelves where bad weather is coming. They look for patterns about where people are buying cold remedies. All of these things drive their knowledge of what's likely to happen. Make sure that the shelves are stocked when you get to the store. In ways large and small, this harnessing of knowledge is going on, and that's the general trend we know as big data. What's new is the rise of really immense data sets, going from thousands of pieces of information to millions to billions, and keeping up with the immense storage capacity of computers to grab and process all of this structured data. Now, this gives you the power of knowledge to make good decisions, but it also gives you the power over people. That in a very real sense, is a great part of the mission of the NSA and the other national security agencies, to understand what is happening in the world so that the United States doesn't just know what's happening, but it can intervene to change things, to understand if, for example, somebody is plotting a military move, how much different might things have looked if we had understood a week before about the Russians being bussed into Crimea to set up, in essence, a coup. That's the mission of an intelligence agency, and gathering those trends gives them power. Often power we wield in ugly and quite violent ways. You think about, for example, drone strikes. That is a kind of power produced by information. Closer to home, this is the kind of power possessed by large internet companies. Google has this power. In many ways, it doesn't want to use it, but every time they change their ranking algorithms, some sites move up and some move down, and if your shoe store has been dependent upon a high Google rank to get its traffic, and you've been bumped downwards, you may be out of a job. You may lose your business because of those changes in the halls where the attention lenses that direct information. In particular, this power over others includes a power to invade privacy in ways we can find quite terrifying. So, for example, this is not just the embarrassing details, the blackmail threats from finding those sexted pictures and threatening to reveal them. It's also a wonderful recent Stanford study. It took a few hundred people and asked, can we look at the metadata, your call records, just see the numbers that you dialed over a period of a few weeks from your cell phone. They didn't expect to learn much. It was only a few hundred volunteers, getting some very basic patterns at most. But then when they looked at the data, just from the list of phone numbers and public directory information, they could see things like subject D, who placed calls to pot dealers, a head shop, subject A, who placed calls to a cardiologist and to a number of other medical providers, and a subject who placed calls to a gun store and to the manufacturer of an AR-style rifle. So even that metadata can be intensely revealing about one's personal life, and in particular hands, you can easily imagine how that could be used to the detriment of the people that it refers to. And so, you get, wherever you have these kinds of concentrated data power in private or public hands, calls for oversight, the concern that we need to prevent abuses of this. This is the calls that responded to the fact that Richard Nixon was using the IRS to inspect the tax records of his political enemies. These are the calls you get when you find out that employees working at the NSA use their database access to look up information on their romantic partners. Practice that even had its own name within the community, known as Loveint, or love intelligence, by reference to HUMINT for human intelligence, or SIGINT for signals intelligence. You get concerns that they will use this power in ways that invade citizens' privacy, or are used to make decisions that we might not, in our democratically elected form, prefer to make. But set up against this, people who keep the big data say, and with good reason, we have our needs for secrecy. Here are all the things that we do that we ruined if you look too closely inside the box. In the private world, for example, they say, if you show our competitors all the data in this big data set, we'll have wasted all the money we spent gathering and putting it together. Our competitors will simply take it, use it themselves, and we'll have no reason to invest in the great expense of gathering, compiling, and analyzing the data. And in the public sector, intelligence agencies say, and with good reason, if you look too closely at what we're doing, you give away the whole game. You give the terrorists, the enemies of the United States, the power to know what we're looking at and to know when we're onto them. The secrecy of our techniques is essential to their success. Let me suggest to you that from that drive to oversight, you get another set of concerns about privacy and secrecy. Not just the privacy of the subjects of the data, but the users of big data itself. One of the visible footprints of big data in modern life is the Greenberger terminal, the information appliance that Wall Street traders and other professionals in finance use that has at their fingertips information about stock prices, bond prices, commodity prices, currency markets, news in the world, almost every source of information you can imagine put together in one convenient location. Well, it came out that Bloomberg News reporters would look to see when Bloomberg terminal users logged in. And based upon this, they could gather information about moves at Wall Street firms. Reporters would call up a partner at Goldman and say, "You haven't logged into your terminal in a while. Is everything all right? Has there been some kind of move?" So it turns out that you can learn an immense amount about a big data user by seeing what it is they look at when they have access to all this information. Think about your search terms. You are a user of an enormous big data resource when you use Google or Bing. It has gathered billions of pieces of information for your convenience, and your search query history is your research trail, as Vannevar Bush would have called it, through that world. What you are looking at, where your eyes are directed, is as revealing as whatever you see. The people who have Google Glass think, "Oh, I'm looking at the world and analyzing it." And people say, "Oh, you're invading my privacy. You're coming into the bar. Don't wear these things into the restroom." But the Google Glass user, the one who's recording all this information, my goodness, how revealing the account that they have would be to see what they looked at, to see where their eyes rested in the room. So what we found out is that big data centralizes power. It means that whoever controls the data, whoever gathers it and sets the terms for access to it, acquires power. They acquire power both over those whom the data concerns and over those who access the data. And this centralization creates a lot of the distinctive anxieties around big data. So one of the fascinating things about Edward Snowden is that his series of whistleblowing revelations are only possible because of what the agencies would call insufficient oversight. His ability to convince other people to log onto the NSA network from his computer while he quietly opened a terminal window to store their credentials so he could go and do research as them. That wouldn't happen in a world where the big data users at the agency were being sufficiently surveilled themselves. In a sense, you might say, if you were defending the NSA, the problem was not too much surveillance, but too little. So if one is concerned about the accumulation of this power in the hands of the barons of data, I want to ask, is there any alternative? The theorist of science, Langdon Winter, has talked about inherently political technologies. Technologies that by their very nature express a certain relationship of power. And the idea of big data, of data that is so enormous, requires so much storage, it can only be held by those with enormous wealth to have huge server farms to keep track of it. Sounds like such a technology. But perhaps if we ride that curve of Moore's law, in which storage space and computer processing power get cheaper and cheaper and faster, maybe there's an alternative. I don't know how it would look exactly. I don't know if it is workable. But think about what democratic data might mean. What if we had enough data for each of us? We brought it together, we needed collaborative projects, things that concerned all of us, under governance structures that we all agreed to. Might that be a fairer, better world of data?
I was afraid I was going to fall off the edge there. Anyway. There's another edge here. I'm the odd man out here somewhat because I'm a civilian in the midst of a bunch of lawyers, which I should have been suspicious first coming through the door. But I also, because of my time at the Bureau of Justice Statistics, I have a very different view of even perhaps definition of big data. And so let me start by talking a little bit about what I see as big data. And then let me go on to catalog a bunch of fears that I have, not only as a result of my colleagues' statements here, but just generally at my time at BGS about looking at things. I think I think big data for me is the change in a world where we have all sorts of data on minute daily transactions of citizens, or even non-citizens, or just people. And so what used to be invisible is now every keystroke is recorded, every transaction is recorded, millions and millions of them. And it's not so much that it's big, but it's pervasive in some sense. And so that, you know, the fact that every time you go through the door of your dorm and you swipe your card, there's a track. Every time you go online and buy something, there's a track. So that's what strikes me as big data, about all this documentation of routine transactions. And it's available, sort of. It's there. Whether it's available in a real sense is another matter. But that's the revolution that I think people are talking about. I think James defined it a little bit differently. But that's the way I looked at that. And so when I was down at the Bureau of Justice Statistics, we produce social indicators of crime, but you have the same social indicators for the economic statistics, unemployment, CPI, all those other gross GNP and things like that, all the things that we sit around and argue about when it comes to tax policy time or any other time. So these are fairly important social indicators to assess the health of our society and help people make policy in some ways. So I think that in an era when most of the routine and standard data collection methodologies like survey research and other things are really going down the toilet. The response rates for surveys are, except for some of the ACS and the current population survey. So the way we used to collect data on our society, both for statistical and research purposes, are being threatened. They're getting more expensive. Comes big data. You know, a statistical agency head is thrilled with big data. Why? Because it's a way for us to gather what we used to gather in these now obsolete ways much more efficiently, much more abundantly, much more disaggregated, so we can say more about things. So you're tremendously excited by the prospect of big data in that sense. So, so I want to distinguish research and statistical uses of data. I see some eyeballs rolling already. As soon as you say statistics, people's eyeballs roll. They're back in their head. So I was at a conference for statistical agency heads, and we were there with the Homeland Security guys. And how many people have heard of Einstein 3? I'm sure you guys have heard of Einstein 3. Einstein 3 is a security program maintained by Homeland Security. When someone comes into a government website, you guys can correct me on this if I'm wrong, comes into a website, they look at the address from whoever that solicitor is coming into the website. And they have a list of addresses that are known to be purveyors of malware and other things, and they compare that address to the address of someone coming in, and then they'll deny them access and look at where they're coming from and a variety of other things. In this particular session, the people from the Bureau of Economic Analysis were there. And they maintain a lot of their data collection on corporations for the unemployment rate and for the GNP calculations. They get input from private companies. And so they guarantee those private companies confidentiality. Otherwise, they wouldn't give them the information because it would affect their market and share and all sorts of things. So the director of the Bureau of Economic Analysis went head-to-head with the people from Homeland Security. The people from Homeland Security said, I want to find out about who this is so I can protect people and we can prosecute them and we can do a whole lot of things. And we need to make these cases, because if you don't think people in China are, this is before all the revelations came out about what we were doing, but if you don't think people in China are in your computer as we speak, you're crazy. So the idea, and the guy from BEA said, if my response rates go down 10%, I'm going to revise the GNP by sort of 2% or 0.5% or something like that. And do you know what that does to the economy? So here you have an idea of what do you use data for? What do you use knowledge for? The prosecution of individual cases or the creation of knowledge, in some ways, on which policy is based. And so I think when I look at big data, I see it as a way for us to increase knowledge. The idea of identifying any individual person is almost incidental to that. Whereas in many ways, all of the things that people described here are situations where they want to go after you. They want your PII, they want to identify as much as they can about you to go after you. Okay? For research purposes, we don't care about you. Only insofar as we can identify you as an individual case, and that we can take the data that we have from one big data collection and merge it with another so that we get much more information about you. That's what we care about. It's anonymous. We don't care about you. Okay, so, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it that way, but it's, so what I'm afraid of, one of the fears that was conjured up here, is that both groups, that is to say, the group that wants to research you, as opposed to the group that wants to identify you and rip you off, are going to be subject to the same kinds of concerns about confidentiality and other things. And so I think the great excitement about big data, the great potential of big data, may not be reached because of this case-by-case orientation that people have. It's compelling to pull out a case. Saying that the GNP is going to go down by X amount doesn't really excite you, unless you're an economist, and that's too late for you anyway. So it's good. So that's what I'm concerned about when I hear these discussions, that everybody's thinking about the idea that people are going after you and that we have to protect you. And my great fear is that we're going to come up with institutional arrangements to protect you that are going to fall disproportionately on the knowledge generators. Because I think that there are ways, I think the National Opinion Research Center, for example, has an enclave. There are ways to protect and anonymize data so that and turn it out for research purposes so that you cannot be identified. But if people take a much more repressive approach, then what's going to happen is that people who own the data, we don't own the data. Some police department or some court or some private enterprise, they own the data. And when we ask them for those data to do the research we want to do, they're not going to give it to us because they're scared to death by all the goings-on about what's going to happen and the fact that nobody can assure confidentiality. I don't know, Len knows more about these things than I do, even though he professes not to be a techie. But the stuff in the Newark enclave, you can't get at. It's not connected to the internet. They bring it behind the wall, match up these databases, put them there for people who subscribe and can research. So I think there are ways, the Census Bureau, the census is about not to conduct the census in the traditional way that it has always conducted the census. That is to say, to have an enumerator come to your door after you refuse to answer the mail thing that they sent to you. Okay, this is the way they do things. They have been able to uniquely match IRS information with other information that was routinely collected on you by the federal government and uniquely identify 305 million people. So you can conduct a census basically by using administrative records and matching those records. Countries in Europe do it. We're just on the cusp. So these kinds of beneficial uses of these things, I think, we're ready to do them now. And if we can separate out the audience that's interested in research and statistical generation, as opposed to those who are interested in going after you particularly, I think we can prevent the cataclysm that I'm afraid is going to happen if we sort of confuse the two. So I just told Bob that I would come up here and share my anxiety, and I did.
Thank you. Now, Professor Michael Greenberger.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to say how happy I am to be here. I think the MLaw program is really a terrific program. Just generally speaking, I can tell you that the law school, University of Maryland, Francis King Carey School of Law, has been very focused on the University of Maryland College Park. The new Empower program in MLaw gives the law school an opportunity to do more work on the College Park campus. We're very much looking forward to it. One of the reasons we're looking forward to it is that everything we have done with the students at College Park, and I would emphasize the undergraduate students, for those of you who are undergraduate students, has been very impressive to the law school. And efforts are underway to make a greater linkage between College Park and the law school. We know you're terrific. We want you to get to know us as being terrific as well. And I think Professor Grimmelmann's talk is some evidence of that. You should discount anything I say in forming your impression about the law school. My concern, really, subject is big data, and my concern is the NSA program. I agree with all the fears that have been expressed about the private collection of data and what that can mean and what that means for privacy. But my focus, my bigger concern is the government's access to private information about us. I think Len, when he was describing the program, is exactly right. We were told for weeks and weeks and weeks that 100% of telephone metadata was being collected. What is metadata? Metadata is who you call and how long you speak to them. The NSA program, I think, was and is ubiquitous because if you call someone, the NSA then looks at everybody. It's called the second hop. Everybody the person you calls, and then there's a third hop, everybody who's called within the second hop, their metadata or their being subject to personal investigation becomes greater and greater. There are lots of different surveillance programs that are at issue. I want to focus, because of the brevity of time, in the so-called Section 215 program, which is the NSA going to a court called the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court and asking for authority to collect whatever metadata they're going to collect. We discovered, or at least I discovered, about a month ago that it was advertised as 100%, everybody's metadata, but the newspaper, Washington Post, a couple Sundays ago said NSA is now saying it's more like 30%. Len came and spoke to our class. I'm teaching a class, by the way, that is principally motivated and developed because of the Snowden disclosures over the summer. I normally teach a course called Homeland Security and the Law of Counterterrorism, and that course is focused on legal issues across the board: Guantanamo Bay, detentions, habeas corpus issues. The course is a 39-hour course. Before the Snowden revelations, I spent 3 hours on foreign intelligence surveillance. After the Snowden revelations, I started the course with the Snowden issues, and I got to 15 hours, and I could have gone on forever, which is why I decided this semester to start a separate course, and I think it's the first course of its kind, to look at the lawfulness and the constitutionality of the Snowden revelations. Whatever percentage of telephone calls that are being made, I believe there is a danger in the government getting that information. I accept wholeheartedly Len's view that as the program is presently run, it is being run honestly, competently, with the best motivations in mind of the people looking at the program. In the Federalist Paper number 10, Madison said that the Constitution is not for angels. The Constitution is for people who are less than angels. What I mean by that is, and Len and I lived through this era, when Nixon was in the White House, he had a group of people in the White House called the plumbers. And the job of the plumbers was to find out information about President Nixon's enemies. Many of you may have historically heard about Daniel Ellsberg, who revealed the Pentagon Papers. And President Nixon wanted to undercut Ellsberg, so the plumbers broke into Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office so they could find embarrassing things about Ellsberg that would mute his influence. I'm not worried about President Obama, and I'm not worried about the NSA as it presently exists. What I'm worried about is there could be a president, for example, who wants to find out who's calling abortion providers, who's calling clinics that provide pregnancy counseling. Is that so far-fetched? I think you can look at some of the candidates who ran for office on the Republican primaries where you could believe that that might be an objective of theirs. So it is not what is happening today, it's the potential for what could happen in the future. And by the way, you may know that when East Germany was separate from West Germany before Germany was unified, they had one of the best intelligence agencies, the Stasi, in the world. And several retired Stasi officers have said, oh, if we only had the ability to do what NSA is doing. Does that mean NSA is doing something wrong? No. But if you've got intelligence agencies whose design was to limit democratic thinking, it shows you the dangers that are here. Now, I think there is good news behind all this. I think good news for everybody. I think there's a win-win situation here. You may have heard today the president announced that for purposes of the bulk collection, he's proposing an alternative system, which is the phone companies by statute have to keep the metadata for 18 months. The switch would be, instead of going to the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court and asking permission to collect metadata, the metadata would be held by the telephone companies, and the NSA or the FBI would go to the Foreign Intelligence Court and say, we have a reasonable, articulable suspicion that somebody is involved in bad acts, and we are asking the court for permission to make specific access to the metadata. Today, 100% of the metadata is collected by court order, but according to my reading, there are 22 analysts in the NSA who make the decision of how they will specify what metadata they are looking at. I think this is a big step forward. What worries me, and Len has said the NSA has not broken the law. I certainly believe the NSA or anybody has not, quote, broken the law with intent, but an analysis was recently done of the statute under which the NSA was operating, Section 215 of the Patriot Act, and the NSA isn't mentioned in that statute. Who's mentioned in that statute? The FBI. The FBI can get metadata if it is, quote, relevant to an FBI investigation. 215 has operated without any concern for the plain language of 215. Now, what worries me very much, if you read President Obama's proposal today, is first he wants Congress to authorize the existing program so they can keep doing it until new legislation is passed to alter the program from a collection of a large amount of metadata to getting court permission to look at specific records. My fear is that Congress will quickly fix what I think is a problem right now, that the statute does not comport with what NSA is doing. They approve what NSA is doing, and we never get the reform because getting legislation is very hard. With regard to Snowden, I think there is a lot to blame Snowden about, and I think Len's revelation when he came to my class a week ago Friday revealed to me, which I've subsequently found out to be true, is that Snowden's not just dealing with intelligence information, but he's dealing with sensitive military information as well, and that certainly is not good. But let me say this, and I've talked to Len about it. Snowden did not have a high school diploma. He does not have a high school diploma. As Len correctly points out, he was disciplined when he was in the CIA. As Len points out, his company, and by the way, let me say, I don't want Len to turn red with blushing, but KEYW, because my Center for Health and Homeland Security has recently been working with KEYW. It is a first-rate technology company. Maryland is damn lucky to have a KEYW within our state, and Len has been a leader in developing cyber businesses in the state, which is good for all of us, no matter what jobs we're seeking. But the point is that how good is the intelligence we're gathering? Should we not have known that Putin was going to do what he did in the Crimea? I just saw a headline this week that said, well, now we've got to start focusing on Russia. Whoa, Russia? We've got to focus on Russia? There was never any assurance that Russia was an angel, and we missed the Crimea invasion. Had we known about it, NATO troops could have gone to the borders, as they are doing now, to keep Russia from doing further bad activities. But even more important than that, think of the Boston Marathon. The older brother had gone to Chechnya. He got training in making homemade bombs. He was emailing back and forth to and calling his family and his other brother, telling them what he was doing. But let's leave that to the side. The Russians called the FBI and said, watch out for this guy when he comes back to the United States. There's been a lot of focus on the terrific response to the Boston Marathon bombing, but no focus on how the hell did the Boston Marathon bombing happen if we've got this great surveillance program. I think the program looks too much at the forest and not enough at the trees. I think the president's proposal heads in the direction of the trees and seeing what each tree is doing. The chairman and the ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee are proposing legislation that goes in the direction of where President Obama goes. But there's a lot more besides this metadata collection that's going on. Now we're dealing with Putin. Who is the most effective foreign leader in dealing with Putin? Who is the United States relying on to deal with Putin? Merkel, the head of the German government, whose cell phone the United States was tapping. Now, we only know that probably because of Snowden. But Snowden was employed by Booz Allen. You never hear the name Booz Allen. Booz Allen gets $6 billion in federal government contracts every year. KEYW turned Snowden down. Booz Allen hired him. They gave him the keys to the kingdom. If Booz Allen were a smaller company, they would be the subject of investigations, but because they're a big and powerful company, they're skating home free. They have no responsibility, at least if you read the newspapers, for what Snowden has done. The head of the Director of National Intelligence was the contractual vice president of Booz Allen. He became Director of National Intelligence. The CIA director, General Hayden, took his job at Booz Allen. That's very, very, very suspicious as far as I am concerned. The final point I'm going to make is, how did Snowden get his top secret security clearance? His security clearance was handled by a private company that contracted with the United States to do security checks on people who need top security clearances. That company has just been indicted within the last 2 months because they gave security clearances without ever doing the investigations. 40% of the security clearances they authorized were never investigated. How could that happen? It was piecework. They got paid according to the security clearances they delivered. So to get the money without doing the work became their objective. You may remember the Navy Yard shooting, I think it was back in April, where a guy went wild in the Navy Yard. He had a top security clearance. Where did the top security clearance come? From the company that was just indicted. So if we're giving top security clearances without investigations, that's a security problem. If we're tapping Angela Merkel's telephone when we're depending on her to stand between us and Putin, that's a national security problem. Not knowing what Putin was going to do is a national security problem. Frankly, my view is all of these problems arose through a lack of attention. I blame the president for that. I blame the National Security Advisor for that. There was no adult supervision in my mind. I don't think Clapper really has sufficient judgment to analyze whether or not what NSA is doing, leave aside whether it's lawful, whether it's effective. We need people with judgment. The president hasn't provided it. I don't believe Clapper's provided it. I don't think anybody in the federal government's provided it. And so I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. I am comforted by the president's proposal today. I'm comforted that there's a bipartisan group who wants to turn their attention to this, but we can't turn our head away from this problem. Thank you.
Okay, at this point, I would like to turn to our panelists and see if anybody has any comments to make on Michael's comments or on any of the other comments that were made. And then I would like to open it up for questions from the audience. Usually we get better questions from the audience than you would get from me. So let me just start though. Len, would you care to respond at all to Michael's comments on Snowden?
Well, I have to first respond to the comment he made when Len said, and Leonard said, well, it was true. I mean, I'm a lawyer, but you have to, the first thing, I believe it the first time. I'm joking.
I missed it.
That's all right. That's all right. Well, there's a lot to talk about, and I can take a lot of time, and I'll try not to do that. But I think it's important to understand the process. So when you talk about this call hopping and hopping and hopping and hopping, the way it really works is, first off, I'll go back to the question I posed earlier, Michael touched on it. The NSA does not collect 100% of all calls. It does not collect the bulk data program is designed, collects telephony, landlines. It does not collect en masse cell phone data. Cell phone data are collected sometimes, but not in that program. So you there is that distinction, but the 215 collection relates to telephony. That's point one. Point two is, it would be very nice if the intelligence community had the ability to manipulate all the data they want to. I guarantee you they don't. That's another point. But so 20%, let's say, of American calls are involved in calls relating to Americans are involved in the process. One can argue about the FISA court, and I do argue that the FISA court needs to have an advocate. I volunteered, even though I have a 24-hour day, 7-day job. I'll go down there anytime anybody calls and says, I'll be the advocate for privacy before the FISA court. It's not there. That's an issue that I think needs to be dealt with. But before those Americans' calls are touched, if you will, is because of the RES that Mike Greenberger talked about. Somebody is gone to the FISA court and said, we believe this is a person of interest and we have a reasonable, articulable suspicion to collect data on. We come at it a slightly different way and say, if you're driving through, I know Baltimore well, I say the city of Baltimore, there's a traffic cameras collecting data on every car that goes past you. I drive by, I'm not committing a crime, my data are being collected. That's going to happen when you say, give me all the data for a particular period of time, all the metadata on phone calls, you're going to get some data that doesn't fit that person of interest. It is discarded. Those hops are not done by anybody who's not a person of interest. It's only done by, you say, this is a bad guy, I want to know what he's up to and who he's talking to. So it is much more limited than we tend to think about. Another point I want to make, Jim talked about anonymization. It's one of my great areas of frustration that we cannot get Congress to understand how data can be anonymized very easily. And I'm a big fan of my Congressman Dutch Ruppersberger, who drives me crazy often, but we had him in the office, we're talking about anonymizing data, and he says, well, how come all the big companies come down and say they can't do it? And I said, well, A, they're incompetent, or B, they're afraid that they'll make a mistake and somebody will catch them and sue them. It can be done, and even the bill that you're talking about, Mike, that is being considered today, we've given the Senate Intelligence Committee and we've given the House Intelligence Committee some ways to do that, privatize the data, anonymize the data, such that is way, way, way down the path where anybody can identify anything about the person. So that's, to some of those points, I'll just make a couple other points and be quiet. I'll say, I think when you make the point about why nobody tracked down the Boston Marathon killer's phone calls, makes the point, they're not collecting everybody's phone calls. If you think that Angela Merkel was really surprised to know her phone call was being collected and she wasn't trying to do it to us, I'll sell you some land in China or something like that. And on Putin, by the way, you make the assumption that because the country didn't act, that they weren't warned, that the intelligence business didn't know. There's a big gap between data coming out of the intelligence community and people acting on it. So I'll stop at that point, so that's what I'd like to talk about.
Would anybody else like to weigh in? James or Jim? Please.
Let me jump in just with a few thoughts about the value and the difficulty of working with anonymized and general data. Because I think, as Jim noted, this tension between the individualized and the statistical is one of the huge, difficult themes we're going to be grappling with over the next decades. We're transitioning from a world in which knowledge was individualized, focused. It came from authorities who could document the exact chain of evidence behind a conclusion, and it applied to a specific answer, to a world in which knowledge is often statistical, a matter of the percentages more likely than not, and traceable through paths that aren't always deducible. If you go to Wikipedia, it's reliable not because you vetted the individual editor who wrote that article and they had particular credentials. It's reliable because on the whole, the process seems to work. It's the same kind of way in which the internet more or less works, even though there's no guarantee that any given packet will get where it's going. And de-identification, anonymization of data, is about managing that threshold between data that's clearly about specific people and data that is useful only for statistical purposes. The dream being, if you can sanitize it perfectly, you can then release the data sets for free use. This is proven very hard in practice because of the ways you can get tripped up. AOL released years' worth of search queries to researchers. It turned out that if you had a bunch of search queries, you could build a pretty precise portrait of people, including where they lived, because they search about things near them, and even what their name is, because who hasn't plugged their name into Google? And so then computer science researchers started developing techniques for saying, this data set really is anonymous, like K-anonymity, that any given criterion you could use to look for a specific person in the data set would be true of at least 5 or 10 or 20 others, so that it wasn't ever truly individual. Well, it turns out that that's not a great definition because you just duplicate each person's record in the database 20 times, and now you have 20 other records that don't pertain to that person. The more modern concepts computer science researchers are working out, one called differential privacy, in which you have a very precise mathematical trade-off between how much privacy you preserve and how much information you can get out of the database for research purposes. So far, the trade-offs don't look very attractive either for privacy or research, but it's a promising line of inquiry. So this is a hard project, but things are maybe easier if you can, when you engage in oversight of how the database is used. If you look for the specific suspicious patterns of queries, maybe it's okay to have the database be more sensitive. And what you do is you vet the research being done on the database rather than vetting the data in the database itself.
Please.
I just want to continue down the geek road on this one.
Yeah,
I think James is absolutely right. I think that the risk you run, for instance, the archives, when I was at BJS, we had to pull back data on the federal courts because the contributing agencies who owned the data were afraid that if it was put up in the archive and people matched it with external data, it used to be you could guarantee confidentiality by going through your data set and assuming that if you took away the discriminators that would allow you to identify somebody, that you did your job. But now that you can go onto the internet and pull down data that's seemingly unrelated, but can be used to inform who this person is, the business of confidentiality is becoming much more difficult. But with the NORC archive, what they're doing is they're limiting who can get in the playground. So you have to be a member of the enclave to get in the enclave. You can't take the data out of the enclave. So what it does is minimize, restrict you to playing with the data and matching and mixing the data that's in the archive itself, which should reduce that a little bit, that risk. So there are a mix of strategies that people can do to keep it. But it's not a simple task, that's for sure.
I just have one more question, and then I want to open it up. I know we're slowly growing short on time. It seems to me that we're talking about privacy, but we're not really quite defining it. We're talking about the benefits of big data, but I'm still a little hazy on what those big benefits are. I'm wondering, is there any evidence, or can anybody on the panel speak to evidence that bulk data actually has enhanced national security? Has it worked?
You're probably looking at me, I think, so I'm going to give that a shot. But
I'm cross-eyed and looking at you.
it's a very difficult, it is very difficult to say this particular item of intelligence led to this particular capture of a bad guy. It's all a puzzle that comes together at some point. So I've heard the arguments, and I've heard the president's panel say there's no evidence that the bulk collection ever found a bad guy. Well, our job, my tech guy's job, is to find amidst all those various pieces of data. There's sort of like, somebody used a term called confetti the other day to describe big data, or somebody else used it's like finding a needle, a bunch of needles. And so how do you know, it's very difficult to say this particular thing led to that, the capture of that bad guy or that prevention of something. So in my view, and all my technical guys would say it's all part of the puzzle. I can't give you a specific instance. If I could, I'd be classified and I'd be shot.
So how much further down the road should we go as a society in supporting the fast movement of technology to be gathering information? What's the justification for that? Research purposes aside, and I would accept that the research purposes are quite valid.
Well, I'm not going to answer that question, but I do want to answer some of the other things. Len says we didn't capture the Boston Marathon bomber because we're not looking at all the metadata. But that begs the question, we're defending, or the defenders of the metadata collection are saying this is protecting you. And the worst attack we've had since 9/11 was the Boston Marathon bomber. Why weren't his emails picked up? The fact that we aren't looking at everybody, well, that means it's not that great a system. But the more important point is that the Russians told the FBI to watch this guy. That's completely forgotten. Nobody watched it. What kind of security system is that? The other thing is, I think there is a fundamental difference between Len and me on how the metadata operation works. Len describes a system that I could live with, and I think it's what President Obama recommended today. You only look at the metadata when you have let's say, reasonable suspicion. My understanding of 215 is that the NSA goes to the court and asks permission to get the bulk of the metadata, whether it's 100%, 30%, or 20%. And then the NSA decides, not the court, what you look at. I think my understanding of it suggests that that's why President Obama said today, we're not going to collect all this stuff. We're going to go to the court to ask for specific permission. If they were already doing that, I don't know why they moved to that kind of reform, but whatever, I can certainly live with a system where the court decides whose privacy is going to be looked at. The other thing I would say is, Len makes the point, the Germans are listening to President Obama. And all I can say is, the Germans were not stupid enough to hire somebody like Snowden, who reveals the fact that we're listening to Angela Merkel. The Germans don't have top security clearances that are done without investigation, so people can profit off of it. The trouble with our system is we look like a bunch of clowns, not to mention the fact that we tried to down the Bolivian president's airline coming from Europe to his home country because they thought Snowden was aboard the plane. This has been one ridiculous effort after another. What it says to me is we need to be smarter and better. And I don't think we're doing that. And whatever we're doing is not protecting us.
Please, I can't resist commenting that my comments have been directed to the legality and the practicalities of the practice. I'm not talking about the competence in it. I think we're on tape, so I'm not going to say anything more about that, but I've been in the intelligence business 40 years, and I won't say anything about the competence of our business, period. So,
I will stipulate that Len thinks NSA is competent.
Thank you, that's recorded.